I'm a little nervous when someone's talking about how smart I am, and what I always tell people is it's not that I'm really smart, it's just that I'm a very hard worker. And I grew up in the country. I didn't grow up on a farm, but I grew up in a farming community, and so I certainly know the value of hard work, and I think I'm just very tenacious. So it's my pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the North Dakota corn growers for inviting me here, and particularly Tom Lilja for inviting me to come today. And Tom asked me, I don't know, 6 or 7 months ago if I would consider coming to this event. And I said, absolutely, this just sounds like a wonderful opportunity. A couple months went by, and he kept saying, have you booked your tickets? Are you sure you're coming? You know it's February 19th, right? And I said, yes, Tom, yes, Tom, yes, Tom. And he said, you know it's in Fargo in February? I said, yeah, no problem at all. I'll be there. And so for the last few months, my husband kept saying, Fargo in February, yeah. And so we were looking at the weather last week, and was it -7 here or something like that? And then we looked at this week, and we saw, oh my gosh, in the 30s. So it's a heat wave. So St. Louis was in the 60s yesterday, which was very nice. So what I'd like to do today is not talk about magic, but I'm going to talk to you about some data and some information. And I know I'll be preaching to the choir here because my first few slides are information about corn production. And then I'm going to transition into a little bit about corn ethanol production. And the reason I'm doing this is, again, I know many of you know many of these numbers, but sometimes it's kind of nice to step back and see an overview of what it is that you're working on. And if you hear some facts and pieces of information that you find kind of interesting, or when your neighbor comes and talks to you, or one of your family members comes and talks to you and says, well, what about this corn stuff, and what about this ethanol stuff? If you have these facts and information in your back pocket, maybe you might have 6 facts that you're going to make sure that you know, so that when you talk to people, you can give them information. And that's what I find is very useful to me when I have people that will come up to me and they will be asking me things like, well, what about this organic food versus conventional gardening? And they know I'm a chemist, and they'll know that I'll give them information about that. And when I start citing some information about organic versus conventional gardening, it just takes a few facts before I let them know the differences and how organic gardening is oftentimes reported to be much more nutritious than food that's brought up in a conventional way. And I say, you know what, there's been study and study and study after study that shows that that's just not true. So if you have some of these facts and information in your back pocket, you yourself can help dispel some of these terrible myths about corn and corn ethanol. And that's one of the things that I fight day in and day out, are misconceptions about corn and corn ethanol. Ken Colombini works in our St. Louis office where I work, and he's the director of communications there. And he will send me one article after another about ethanol, and finally I'll just say, that's it. I've had enough for today. I don't want to see any more. So we spend a lot of time trying to turn this around. So that's why it's important that you yourself can be an ambassador for corn and corn ethanol production. We have a great story to tell. You have a great story to tell. I am just your ambassador. I'm not a corn farmer, but I work on behalf of you. So what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about NCGA, National Corn Growers, and really I just wanted to give you an overview of the organization. I know many of you know about it. You're a member of North Dakota Corn, so that automatically makes you a member of NCGA. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the great work that the Ethanol Committee does, and it's an action team that's run at the grassroots level. So basically it's the farmers that set the direction of what we're going to work on in the Ethanol Committee. Then, like I said, I wanted to highlight some really good facts in terms of corn production and corn ethanol production. And then, finally, I'd like to talk about the Renewable Fuel Standard. I know many of you know a little bit about this, maybe a lot about it, but I wanted to kind of give you an overview of the Renewable Fuel Standard, what its purpose is, what it has accomplished for the farming community, as well as the environment in general. And then this latest thing in terms of the RVO, the Required Volume Obligation. That's the big deal. That's the thing that we've been spending a lot of work on. Many of you in this room, I'm sure, wrote letters, wrote emails, perhaps you even called the White House. We had a terrific response for that RVO campaign that we just wrapped up. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about consumer demand. That's going to be the segue into Dean Drake, who is retired from GM, and I consider him an autos expert. And he has done a lot of good work, particularly with Minnesota corn growers, and most recently I've been working a lot with Dean to talk about how we can increase those communications between the automobile manufacturers and the fuel producers. So the National Corn Growers Association, as you know, is a membership-run organization. There are 28 corn states that are members of the National Corn Growers Association, representing over 40,000 members. And if you step back even further and you say, well, where do the funds come from? You all know where the fund comes from. It's through the checkoff program. The checkoff program has 300,000 folks that contribute to the checkoff program. So many people think that they have one or maybe two bosses, or maybe you don't have a boss, maybe you're your own boss. I feel like I have 300,000 bosses. And I grow up, or I don't grow up, but I did grow up around cornfields, but I currently live in the midst of a bunch of cornfields. And every day I get to see that corn grow in the summertime, and I feel like that is part of who's paying my salary. So 28 member states, 40,000 grower members, 300,000 in the checkoff program. The NCGA Ethanol Committee is shown here, and now I'm going to try and use the pointer and the clicker at the same time. We'll see how I do. So these are the staff, myself, and then Beth Elliott. She is the Director of Public Policy. She works in Washington, D.C. She is the lobbyist on behalf of biofuels for the corn growers. And then right behind Beth is Melanie Gibson. She is my assistant, and she does a great job at helping me stay organized and helping me know where I'm supposed to be and when I'm supposed to be there. You might recognize someone in the back row here. Kim Swinson is currently a member of the Ethanol Committee. And before Kim, we also had Kevin Skunas, who now sits on the Corn Board for NCGA. So if any of you are interested in sitting on this committee, all you have to do is apply through the North Dakota Corn Growers, and you too can be on the Ethanol Committee. This is a group of farmers or growers, as I said, and we have folks from all over. So there are folks on this committee from Minnesota, Missouri, Illinois, Iowa, North Dakota, and so forth, and Nebraska. And it's a grassroots organization, like I said, so it's this committee that works on these 5 different areas related to corn ethanol production. Those 5 general areas are policy, so the RVO, the RFS, that's a great example of the policy issues that we have to be thinking about all the time. We also work on maintaining and expanding markets. So it's great that we have ethanol as E10. It's great that we have the RFS. How can we maintain that? How can we move to other things? The environmental impact, not only of ethanol production, but of corn production. And as I'll be talking about, one of the great things about ethanol, and the reason that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is behind it, is because corn ethanol produces less greenhouse gas emissions than when you produce gasoline from petroleum. Corn ethanol produces less greenhouse gas emissions. That's including starting at the very seed that you put into the ground to when you put that fuel in your car. It produces less greenhouse gas emissions than converting petroleum to gasoline. When the EPA put the renewable fuel standard in place, they said that we're going to categorize cornstarch ethanol as a conventional biofuel. What that means is that it had to have a 20% better score on greenhouse gas emissions compared to converting petroleum to gasoline. That's why corn ethanol is in the conventional category. And the other thing they said was, it doesn't have to be today, but by 2022, it has to have that score. By 2022, the conventional fuel has to be 20% better than petroleum being converted into gasoline. Well, guess what? We're there today already. And many people, including myself, would argue that we're actually closer to about 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when comparing gasoline production from petroleum. It's a wonderful fuel. We also talk about co-products, and as many of you know, in the corn ethanol production process, we have 2 main co-products, and those are the distiller's grains, very important in the animal feed industry, as well as oil. We also spend a lot of time talking about education and promotion because, like I just said, there's a lot of misconceptions out there about ethanol, and it's really important that we work to correct those misconceptions. That's why I encourage each of you to write down several facts that you might hear today that you memorize and keep in your back pocket, because nobody's going to change this around unless it's coming from us. So now let's talk about some numbers. Many of you could probably come up with these numbers yourself. But in the last couple of years, we see that the feed and residual category for corn is about 40%. That's what takes up about 40% of the market. And as many of you know, many people misunderstand that distinction between corn as food versus corn as feed. And corn feed, that's one of the things I'm constantly sharing with people. Corn feed is for animals. That's what the animals are eating to produce the meat that we like to consume. Ethanol takes about 30% of the corn, and that's once you account for the co-product of distillers' grains, which is about 10%. And then export market has been about 8%, and then this final category, the food, the seed, and the industrial uses is around 12%. So let's step back and say, well, if we say that the feed and residual, that's about 40%, and the distillers' grains goes in this same category, so now that's up to about 50%. And if we say the export market is about 8%, and most of what gets exported is used for animal feed, we're almost up to about 60% of the corn is used for animal feed, and about 30% is used for ethanol. The remaining, again, is the food, the seed, and the industrial uses. So that's something you might want to point out to people, because what I hear a lot of times is, oh, that corn, it's sucking up all that, or the ethanol is sucking up all that corn, it's driving the prices through the roof, it's all ethanol's fault, everything's ethanol's fault. And that's something that we cannot let people say. We have to be able to point out these statistics. What I often tell people, too, is, well, golly, 30% of the crop, that's a lot, right? Yeah, it is. And what I tell them is, you know what? Production agriculture has increased over the years, and in fact, farmers are growing more corn per acre than they have ever in the history of time. Back in the 1920s, does anybody want to take a guess on what the bushel per acres were back in the 20s? 20 to 25 bushels per acre back in the 1920s. And now we just saw this morning, what was the average yield? It was like 158, and that was below trend. For those of you that follow the corn yield contest that NCGA sponsors on an annual basis, and the winners are going to be announced next week, it's a big deal. The winners have gotten up to 400 bushels per acre. Now that's a big deal, and you know that you have to baby those, that soil that corn grows in, but the point is you can get 400 bushel per acre corn. So not only have a lot of improvements been made, a lot more improvements are to come. And it's because of you and your ingenuity that we can continue to see these greater yields. We often say that medical doctors practice medicine. I say farmers practice farming, because you're always continually improving in what you do. Well, what about if I do it this way? And what if you do it that way? And so forth. And I think as we become more sophisticated in our technological advances, we realize that one soil type does not fit all. And we can't farm the same way on any one particular soil type. And in fact, within the same field, you know that there's differences within your soil. So I think this idea of precision agriculture, knowing and understanding all these different variables that it takes into account in terms of what your soil quality is, how that soil quality changes per field, what is the best seed that's going to go into that particular plot, and these very sophisticated planters that can go along and go, okay, I'm in this region of the plot, I know I've got more clay here, I know I've got more salt here, we're going to change the hybrid, then we're going to move to another place, and we're going to change it again. And it can be done without even being in the tractor. You can sit in your office and make some of this stuff happen. These are these advances that are coming in the future. That combined with, we don't live in just a tiny little local spot anymore. We have to think about what's happening across the globe. So even though there's places on the planet where their yields are very low, 20, 30, 40 bushels per acre, these advances will be coming to them as well too, as we further develop and enhance particular hybrids that can grow in some of these challenging soil conditions. The next slide that I wanted to show you was a little bit more about this FSI category. Now, I know that you can't read those, but the reason I'm showing this to you is I actually have this blown up in my office on a great big poster, and it shows all these different areas where corn is used in that FSI category. You, too, can get this poster. Just go to the Iowa State University and Google corn uses. They have one just like this, only it's for soybean. So if you ever want to show people all the different ways that corn can be used, I really like this poster for that. And as Mark mentioned, I was in the education business for a while, so I like to think a big part of what I do is education and communication. And again, I want to encourage each of you to think about being an ambassador for your product. So here's what I was talking about in terms of production agriculture. Oh my gosh, look what's happening here. So if we look at this red line, this is planted acres. Overall, we've actually come down in the amount of planted acres, but what's happened is production has gone up. And you all know why that is, because we're getting more bushels per acre. So that's a terrific advancement in the field. And while these advances has been happening, while we have been increasing production agriculture, while we have seen all these great enhances in the yields, that is the production per acre, all these other things have been happening too in terms of sustainability. Farmers have been doing it by decreasing their land use, decreasing their soil loss, decreasing irrigation, decreasing energy, and decreasing the impact on the climate. You have a great story to tell. So when people start saying things about corn, and it is big on the environment, right? It does take a lot to use it, but you know what? Look at all of these advances that have happened, and they're only going to keep getting better and better and better. And that's the other thing. People will sometimes bash corn or bash ethanol, and I just look at them and say, you know what? You tell me a perfect feedstock. If you want to feed the billions of people that are on this planet, we have to be able to grow something and do something. But the fact of the matter is we have to think about doing it in a sustainable way so that it's there for future generations. And this shows right here that corn farmers are doing just that. I really like this poster. Again, this is another one of those quick visuals that you can take a look at. So this shows us the land needed to grow 1 bushel of corn over time. So back in 1866 to 1920s, we needed, let's say it's about 1,500 square feet to grow a bushel of corn. Bushel of corn is what, 56 pounds? And if you just calculate, what's that on a per pound basis? If you consider $4 a bushel corn, if you do the math, that's 7 cents a pound. So tell that to people, 7 cents a pound. I think you get more for lightning bugs than that, right? It's a very cheap feedstock. So continuing on, you can look and see how the square footage has actually decreased over time. And in 2030, it's predicted that it's only going to take 145 square feet to produce 56 pounds of corn. That just blows my mind. Now, keeping in mind that idea of 7 cents a pound, when people say, oh, that corn, it's driving up the price of food, it's causing havoc on this and this and this, just say, wait a minute. And I'm happy to share this slide with any of you. Just send me an email, just go to the NCGA website, you can find me. And take a look at some of these numbers here. Assuming $4 a bushel corn, and if you want to look at a box of cornflakes and say, well, how much corn would it take? You need 12.9 ounces of milled corn to produce one 18-ounce box of cornflakes. That's 6 cents worth of corn. Now, even if the price of corn doubles to $8 a bushel, that's going to make your cornflakes go up to 12 cents. Really? It's not that much. It's a very small percentage. Just like when you go out to eat at a restaurant, ask people, do you think that that food really costs you $15 a plate? Well, no, it's the napkins, it's the building, it's the waiter or the waitress, it's all the other things that go along with it. That's the same thing with food prices. Most of our food prices is not the commodity price. It's not the actual food that went into it. That's only about 15% of the cost. The rest of it is packaging and transportation. Just like when you go into a restaurant, you know that that plate of food, you could make it at home for, pennies on the dollar, but it's because it's being served to you that costs a lot of money. Same thing with food prices. And the data just does not support that. As corn prices have dipped, what we've seen is that the price of chicken breast and the price of turkeys and the price of boneless pork chops have not decreased to the same level. They maybe decreased a percentage point or two or increased in cost. The data does not support that corn has influenced food prices. Another example here, and again, you might just want to jot down one of these. If you want to produce a pound of beef or a pound of pork or chicken, this is the amount of corn you need. 2.6 pounds of corn at 7 cents a pound is a whopping 18 cents. So when people start moaning and groaning, have these facts in your back pocket and say, really? How much do you think a pound of corn costs? How much corn do you think it takes to produce a pound of beef? This is the cost of corn for a pound of beef. I get so mad at those arguments because it just doesn't hold water. But people believe that stuff that gets planted in their head because someone they trusted told them that information. Sounds good, right? Boy, organic gardening. You hear harps when you buy that stuff. But it's not supported that it's more nutritious. What's in a kernel? I'm sure, again, you could guess all of this. Sometimes I see numbers up closer to 72% or so, but let's say it's around 62% starch, 15% moisture, up or down. It's about almost 4% oil. And then 19% protein and fiber. So when you take a look at this, and I wrote this polymer of glucose here. Glucose is a sugar, And any sugars end in those same three letters, ose. So you have fructose, sucrose, lactose, glucose. Those are all sugars. Whenever you hear a word like that, it's ending in that OSE means that it's a sugar. As it turns out, polymer, poly means many, mer means units. So if you have a polymer of something, you have many units of that item hooked together over and over and over. So proteins are polymer of amino acids, DNAs are polymers of nucleic acid, and starch is a polymer of glucose. And guess what? That other source that we hear some people talk about sometimes, that cellulosic feedstock, cellulose, grasses, corn stover, corn kernel, whenever you hear that word cellulose, that's a fancy word for fiber. So we know it's important to have fiber because it keeps the plumbing running smoothly, right? That's because we can't digest that fiber, but fiber is just cellulose. Cellulose is made up of a polymer of glucose. It's just that those units of glucose are hooked together differently. That's why in starch, we can digest the starch because the enzymes in our stomach and our body recognize it and can break those apart and break down the glucose and use it for other things. But when those glucose units are hooked together just a little bit differently, those same enzymes and processes in our body don't recognize it. But we can get cellulose from many, many different plant feedstocks. So then down here, if you think about what happens when you're converting this kernel into ethanol, this starch is what gets converted into the ethanol. It's the glucose that gets converted, just like it's the glucose from cellulose feedstocks that get converted into ethanol. What's left over is this oil and protein and fiber. So really, you're losing about 2/3 of this mass to the starch process, but we've got these nice co-products. Don't call them byproducts, call them co-products, because that has a little bit better mental way of explaining it, that this is a very valuable product in this process. So what happens is, since this is about 2/3 of the kernel and the rest of this is about 1/3, what's left over is actually increased in concentration about 3-fold. So those distillers grains that we call DDGs, those are actually, if you triple this number, it's close to about 10%, 8 to 10% oil in distillers grains, unless you pull that oil fraction out. And then you've got about a 20% combination of protein and fiber. Thus, it's a very good feedstock source for distillers grains. Next, I wanted to talk about what happens when you have a bushel of corn. I need to check my time. Where's that big clock? I don't see the time. Okay. When you have a bushel of corn, that's about 30 pounds of starch, and you can convert that into sweetener, or you can convert it into ethanol, which is about 3 gallons of ethanol. I had to put a little chemical formula over here because I think of things in terms of chemistry. And then what happens is what's left over from once you convert that 56 pounds into the 30 pounds of starch and convert that into ethanol, you've got about 17.5 pounds of distillers grains. Then you've also got about 1.5 pounds of corn oil. And this is not food grade oil. This is used generally, again, in the feedstock market. So this is one of those cool facts that I like to cite with people. When I was down at a NASCAR race in Dallas, we actually had about 3 gallons of water, it was supposed to be the ethanol, and then we had 17.5 pounds of distillers grain on display, and we also had 1.5 pounds of corn oil. And people came up to the booth, they had no idea that these other co-products were made along with ethanol. So now we're going to transition and talk a little bit about the purpose of the RFS. Many of you might remember that it was President Bush that signed the RFS into place. And the 3 main reasons that the EPA is supposed to administer this, the Renewable Fuels Standard, is to decrease the reliance on petroleum. A lot of times you hear people say decrease reliance on foreign oil. Decrease greenhouse gas emissions. This right here is the reason why it's under the purview of the Environmental Protection Agency, because they're the ones that control greenhouse gas emissions, and to enhance the rural economy. So I just wanted to quickly overview, has the RFS done what it was supposed to do since 2007? And the answer is wholeheartedly, absolutely it has. So now let's go through a review of what the Renewable Fuel Standard is. You probably have seen this graph a lot of different times. And basically, the Renewable Fuel Standard is what mandated the production of biofuels in several different categories. The category that we think about for cornstarch ethanol is the conventional category, and that was the one I mentioned earlier, where the EPA said by 2022, this category has to have a 20% savings in greenhouse gas emissions compared to gasoline production from petroleum. And remember I said We had until 2022 to get there. We're there today. In fact, we're closer to 50% savings. The other categories are shown here in different colors. So the red is the cellulosic biofuel. And remember I said, excuse me, cellulose is made of that same building block, glucose, that's in starch. They're just hooked together differently. Feedstocks, again, are grasses, corn stover, corn kernel fiber, municipal solid waste, wood pulp. There's all kinds of sources of fiber. Basically, any plant will have cellulose in it. The other categories, then, that we can see here in purple, that's biomass-based diesel, try saying that 3 times in a row, as well as other advanced fuels. So there are other things that can fall into this category. So the advanced category has to have at least a 50% savings in greenhouse gas reduction. Excuse me. The cellulose category actually has a 60% savings in greenhouse gas reduction savings. But anything in the advanced category has to have at least a 50% reduction. So now let's take a look at those 3 reasons that the RFS was put into place. Did the RFS decrease reliance on foreign oil? Absolutely. Now, there were other things that were happening as well, too. And this graph shows us over time how much foreign oil we actually have imported. We have grown and grown and grown in our reliance on foreign oil. And while we see a dip from 2007 when the RFS2 was enacted, part of the reason for this dip is because cars are becoming more efficient. They're using less petroleum. People are actually driving less. There's some hypothesis out there that kids of today are perfectly happy sitting at home on the computer. I know that many of my children's friends were not like me and my friends. Boy, the day I turned 16, I was at the DMV getting ready to get my driver's license. They're like, I'll get it when I'm 17, 18. Perfectly happy sitting in my own little world on the computer. So there are other reasons why this dip, but the point I want to make here is that we still import 3 billion barrels a year of petroleum. And I want to make a point here. It's not that NCGA or corn growers or anybody else is saying we're not for petroleum. We're not saying get rid of petroleum, but we're saying it's important that we diversify our energy resources. Many of you, I'm sure, know that the Model T Ford was designed to grow on agricultural products, namely ethanol. And so it's important that we think of various ways to get our energy. The transportation sector uses 2/3 of the petroleum that is utilized in this country. And that transportation sector puts about 1/3 of the total greenhouse gases into the air. We're very reliant on our cars. And imagine if something happened to that fuel source. So I look at energy security as energy diversity. Whether or not we can produce it all here at home, which is great to have those jobs here at home, that's a wonderful thing. But remember this, there's a limit. And a lot of people don't realize that when you pump oil out of the earth, it doesn't get remade. That's it. And we can debate all day long if there's a 100-year supply, if there's a 200-year supply. The fact of the matter is, getting petroleum has become dirtier and more greenhouse gas intensive. And it's just a balance. Again, it's not a perfect thing. Neither is ethanol. Neither are other sources. But we have to balance it in terms of looking at the overall picture. What is the best thing to do? So greenhouse gas emissions for petroleum to gasoline production have gotten dirtier since the RFS was enacted, and corn ethanol has gotten better. The second point that we made was RFS was supposed to decrease our reliance on petroleum, foreign oil in particular. It was supposed to decrease the greenhouse gas emissions. Again, that's why this ruling is under the Environmental Protection Agency. Has it happened? Absolutely. Since 2007, we've seen a reduction of approximately 200 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, the equivalent of taking 39 million cars off the road. That's an incredible advancement. The EPA, as I've mentioned already, that by 2022 we would get to this 20% level. We're already there, and in fact, we're better than that. So tell that to the people that ask you questions about ethanol. It's cleaner. And thirdly, the RFS was put into place to help spur the rural economy and the economy in general. Has that happened? Yes. If you want to know more about this information I've summarized for you, the NCGA has our RVO letter comments online, and they were about 33 pages in length. It addressed these 4 points. That is, what was the RVO that we recommended, how the RFS has impacted petroleum usage, greenhouse gas reductions, as well as spurred the rural economy. So there's a 33-page document that summarizes all of this information. So let's go through just a few of the points that were listed in our RVO comment letter. The RFS, since it was enacted in 2007, total direct government payments adjusted to $2009 have decreased. Billions of dollars have been saved because of the RFS, because the government is not making as many payments for direct payments. Since 2005, the farming sector property tax payments have increased by 28%. What happens when your property tax payments go up? Who benefits? The community, the schools, the library, the fire department. Those are all great things that, because of the RFS, have trickled into the surrounding economies. Since 2005, an increase in ag-related jobs have increased by 5.4%. That's higher than most other sectors. And finally, since 2006, 97% increase in farm income. That's incredible, and what a wonderful story. So now let's talk a little bit about the required volume obligation. This was the big thing that was due on January 28th. And I don't mind telling you, I spent a lot of weekends at my computer working on the information that went into this document. But it was a really great story to tell. And I know all of these things that I just summarized for you, that's just a glimpse at the things that we put into this document. How am I doing on time? 2 minutes? 2 minutes. So just briefly, the RFS2 statute, what is in the law is in this category. What the EPA has proposed is in this category. And what the NCGA has proposed is in this category. So remember, we talked about what categorizes these things in terms of these various areas here. So cellulose is a 60% reduction. Biomass-based diesel in advanced is at least a 50% reduction. And then total biofuel. So the total biofuel that was supposed to be produced in the statute is 18.15 billion gallons. The EPA proposed 15.21, and NCGA said 18. Now, they don't list this conventional, that is the cornstarch category, individually. What you have to do is subtract the advanced from the total. So 18.15 minus 3.75 is 14.4, and so forth. So what you've seen everybody saying is make sure EPA keep that level at 14.4 billion gallons. Don't drop it to the 13.01. If they dropped it by this amount, that represents about 500 million bushels of corn. The RFS must stay the course. Why is that important? Because it's going to confound agricultural planting and marketing. 30% of the crop is for ethanol production. If you don't know that there's going to be a market there for that or not, that's going to impact what you're planting. It's going to threaten the economic viability of corn growers, ethanol producers. It's going to put greenhouse gas emissions on the table. There's going to be a loss of savings in greenhouse gas emissions. Diminish energy security. If we decrease our flexibility, we're going to be diminishing energy security. And then other plans for the future, people are going to just have a big degree of skepticism in terms of, well, heck, if the government is going to walk away from this great energy policy, what else are they going to walk away from? Finally, the last point I wanted to make is that the automobile manufacturers have published documents in peer-reviewed journals showing that higher blends of ethanol, that is in the 20 to 30% range, many of you know that ethanol has a lower BTU per gallon than gasoline. And so if you fill up with E85, you're not going to go as far on that E85 vehicle. But what automobile manufacturers have published in documents is saying, if we can optimize the engine with the fuel, we can make an engine just as efficient as anything else, as long as we've got that octane from ethanol. And so the bottom line that I always try to tell people to think in their head is ethanol is great because it's got octane. It's a cheap source of octane, especially considered if you're comparing it to BTX, benzene, toluene, and xylene. That's where refiners currently get their octane fraction, and that's a very expensive way to get that octane. It's renewable, and it's non-toxic. If you can remember those 4 things about ethanol, it's non-toxic, it's renewable, it's cheaper than BTX, and it's a great source of octane. Ethanol has an octane value of about 110. That's amazing. Moving to ethanol, higher blends requires all of us. The thing I really want to jump up and down about today is you all need to promote ethanol. This is a big deal if the EPA lowers conventional. And if we get anything less than 14.4, that's a huge loss to this industry because it's signaling what the EPA is thinking about doing in the future. And when you hear API talk, what they say is, we're going to slash the RFS, and next we're going for all of it. So they're going for the throat. They do not want ethanol. We have to fight this. And we cannot let them decrease it to anything less than 14.4, what's in the statute. And the other thing that you can do is you can buy FFEs, use E85 and E15. And if your local retailer is not pricing E85 in an energy parity way, you need to go in and bang your hand on the desk and ask them why they're not doing that. Because, say, ethanol typically is available for 50 cents to $1 cheaper than gasoline. How can E85 cost more than gasoline, than E10? That makes no sense. So you yourself need to promote this by buying FFEs. And the other thing that we just learned at the action team meeting back in Detroit when we met, we thought that FFEs were going to be produced at 50% of the production levels for Ford, GM, and Chrysler up through 2016. What we found out is 2012 was the peak year. They're going to start scaling back dramatically on the number of FFEs. There's 16 million of them on the road today. There's a lot of FFEs out there. If you drive an FFE, please fill up with the 85. We've got to create this demand for ethanol. It was supposed to be the petroleum industry and the blenders. They're the ones that are held accountable. When you read the RFS law legally, the petroleum manufacturers were supposed to integrate that infrastructure, allowing for E85, and it did not happen. It's been mostly because of state corn grower associations that have put the infrastructure in place. So we definitely are working on that on the side in terms of infrastructure, but just to let you know, that was part of the plan. So that's why the automobile manufacturers got all these great incentives, because in the RFS it said, we know we're going to be producing 36 billion gallons by the year 2022. What's going to use this ethanol? It's going to be FFVs. Well, as it turns out, of those 16 million on the road, only about 5% of them fill up with E85. We have got to change that. We've got to create this demand. Or else, the reason that the EPA said that they want to decrease those levels is they're saying the infrastructure, it's not there. The fuel is not being provided. And we've reached this thing that they call the blend wall, where all of the ethanol that's being made is blended into 95% of the fuel. 95% of the fuel in the United States has 10% ethanol.